Hello everyone and welcome back to ASP.NET Core 1.0. My name is Steve Bishop, and in this video we're going to talk about controllers and the controller class. So your MVC controllers should inherit from the abstract class called controller. And there's a few different reasons why you'd want to do this, but there are two primary reasons I'm going to go over in this video. First, the controller class has properties that are relating to the request and response objects. So you get a lot of useful properties built right into the controller class that you have direct access to when you base your controllers on this controller class. Now, methods need to return a type of iActionResult, or that means to say they need to return some sort of class that implements the iActionResult interface. And the controller class has a bunch of these predefined methods that return different data types that implement the iActionResult interface. So with the controller class, you get built right into it, not only all of the properties that you might need to kind of directly interact with the request and response objects, but you also have all of these predefined methods that implement some sort of iActionResult interface. So to see this in action and kind of take a look behind the scenes and pull back the curtain a little bit, I'm going to hop out into Visual Studio and ILSpy. So here in my home controller, it is a home controller class that is based upon or inherits from this controller class. And the controller class is in the namespace Microsoft.ASP.NET.MVC, and that's why up above here we have this using statement of Microsoft.ASP.NET.MVC. And you can see if I hover the mouse over it, the IntelliSense tells us that the controller class is a base class for an MVC controller. So I'm going to go ahead and right-click on the controller class and go to the definition. And this, once again, just like I showed you in the previous video, we've got a bunch of these properties and methods on our controller class. So let's take a look at some of the properties that we get as part of this controller class. We have an action context property, which returns a type of action context, an action binding context called binding context, an HTTP context, which is something a lot of ASP.NET developers should be used to seeing. This HTTP context is something you get handed down in the ASP.NET framework. And this really gives you a lot of access to the requests and response objects. But not only can you find those requests and response objects through this HTTP context object, but you actually have them right here as well. There's the request, the HTTP request object, and it's a property of request. And then here's the HTTP response object called response. So right here on our home controller now, I can access those properties that exist on my controller here. So for example, the request object, I can go right to the request property that's on my base class called controller and dig around inside here to see, is it an HTTP request? Was the method a get, a put, a post, or delete? Which typically, when you're dealing with things like web API, that's very important to know. And you can see the path of the request, any special headers that might be part of it, and checks to see has form content type. So there's a lot of information that you're being passed into it here, like the string query, that is the request object, which is derived from the web browser or any sort of client that's making a request to your web server. That request is going to come attached as part of this request object. Now there's also the HTTP context, HTTP, let me try that again, TTP context, and on that you can see once again is our request object as well as our response object. So you can get at either of those two objects the same way. It's just that on the controller object, you have both of those properties. And they're automatically populated with the data by the MVC architecture. So this controller class has all of these properties automatically getting filled in for you when the controller gets called. So when your home controller class gets instantiated, it's going to go to the base controller here and populate all the data into all of these properties. So you don't even have to worry about that. It's just already done for you, and the request and response information is right there. So one of the other neat things you can do, and just to show you and illustrate how useful this can be, I'm going to go right to the response object on our base controller, and I'm going to set on the response object. We'll see there's a bunch of properties that we can manipulate here on the response, but one of them is the actual status code, and we can set this to something like a 404 error. And that's not too particularly useful. I mean, obviously, if somebody lands on this index action, we probably want some sort of result to come back, not a 404 error. But you'll see that if we set this status code to 404, even if we return a view, what do you suppose is going to happen on that browser when it sees that their status code is 404? Well, let's go ahead and run the application and take a look. So we can see that even though our index action returns a view with some data in it, it doesn't really matter because the browser sees that the status code that we set here on the response object was a 404, and that immediately tells the browser, oh, we can't find a page. So you can kind of trick browsers into certain things. You could make this a 302 error or a 404 or a 200, and you can set that status code directly right there within your controller. Now, typically you don't want to do things like that particular example because whatever you're returning as part of the view will actually, or I should say, whatever you're returning back in your from this index action, that method, like this view method, for example, will already set the status code for you. So since it found it, it's going to go ahead and set the status code to 200 on your behalf. And those status codes will be set because of the particular method that you choose. Now this view method, as we saw in the last video, comes from the controller object. And if we scroll down here, we'll find we have several different view methods that we have to choose from. I'm going to go back up here to the top though and show you that another method we have is the content method, where we can pass in a string of type content. And the return object that the content method returns is a type called ContentResult. So I'm just going to show you in ILSpy what's going on here with this content method. I'm going to go back up here and copy this DLL file because I don't currently have it open in ILSpy. So I'm going to reopen ILSpy. And let's go ahead and paste this DLL file name here and open it up. And remember, the namespace that our controller object was in was Microsoft.ASP.NET.MVC. So we're going to go to Microsoft.ASP.NET.MVC. And there's our controller class right there. I'm going to go ahead and expand controller, and we can see all of the different properties and methods that are on our object, or on our class, I should say. And there's the content method that accepts a string. And you can see that the content method that accepts a single parameter of type string just simply calls return this content method, and this time it has content as string that it's passing into this content method and a null object. And this is what's called chaining constructors or chaining methods, where you have one method that is calling another method that is an overload of the same name. And eventually it trickles down to one or maybe two methods that are the actual methods doing something. So it looks self-referential, but what's really happening is if you look very carefully at the signature here, it's calling this content method on this class object that accepts two parameters, one of type string that we get the value from right here as the original parameter. So if we look at the next content method here in our class, we can see there's a signature with a content object or content parameter of type string that accepts another string called content type. And remember, this method here was passing in a null value for that second parameter. So we're looking here, we get a null value for the second parameter, and there's some sort of string being passed into this first parameter. And lo and behold, all this is doing is chaining another method request. So it's going to this content, but this content method has 3 parameters. And so we're moving along here. This is going to be another string, the string that gets passed along here by this parameter. And then this content type is a null because this content type parameter here was passed a null object. So content has some string, content type is null, and now it's passing on another null object to this third method called content. So if we look here for a content method that accepts 3 parameters, there you go right there, string, string, encoding. So if I click on that, we see string of content type, and encoding type of content encoding parameter. So we can see we're still chaining more and more of these methods, okay, until you eventually get down to this one. So we have some sort of value in the content for the string, the content parameter. You have a null value being passed into the content type parameter, and you have a null value being passed into this content encoding parameter. And we can see here now the code behind this content method is it creates some sort of object of type media type header value and sets its initial value to a new media type header value class and passes into the constructor the content type, which remember is null. So there's a null value being passed into this constructor. Now, what can be a little bit confusing is if you look at this, you'll see this set underscore encoding, and it looks like it's a method call. And that's kind of true. What's really happening here, though, is it's your set accessor that's being invoked here, okay? It is setting, okay, on the encoding property, the value of content encoding. So this content encoding parameter, which again is null from the value that was passed in the previous call, it's sending null and setting this encoding property to null, and then it returns this content. So it's returning this content expression 8. So this is a little trickier here. It's calling yet another method, okay? It's calling another content method, just like all the other ones that we've called. But this time, the signature is passing some sort of string of content, okay, and some data type of media type header value, because expression 8, expr object, is a data type of media type header value. So whatever the method is that's being called here must accept a string and a media type header value. And if we look here, there's another content method that accepts a string and media type header value. So all of that chaining of methods eventually leads us to this final content method, and it's accepting once again a string of content and then that object of a type media type header value that had the null value that was passed into the constructor. I hope you remember that. I hope everybody's following along with me here. This is kind of complicated. So now it creates this new object of a type content result, and it's called expression underscore 05, and it's setting this new variable of expression 05 to a type of new content result. So it's instantiating a new content result class, okay? So there we finally get our instantiation of some sort of class object of type content result, which all of these methods that have been chaining together are supposed to be returning a type of content result. But it hasn't been up until this point now that we actually see that object being created. And now, once again, there's that set underscore. So the set accessor on the content property is being set to the content that was passed in to the constructor. And then here we have the content type parameter, the content type property is being set to whatever the content type object is, which is this media type header value parameter here called content type. is being set to the content type property. And now the content method finally returns our new expression05 object that has its content property and content type property set to whatever was passed in here to this content method. And so now it's finally being returned back and trickles all the way back up to our original call, which was this content method, because again, it's returning the value that comes from that chain of methods. And that has to be a type of content result. And I'm just going to show you if we actually look at the content result class. So I'm going to right click on this and go to the definition. Look at what we have here for properties. The string of content, the media type header called content type, okay? And that's all being set by those chaining of methods that eventually trickle down through this content method. And that's why ILSpy sometimes just really comes in handy to really kind of look behind the scenes and peek at the code that's running to really nail down what's going on. We ultimately find out that the content string that we initially passed into the content method up here finally got its way to the content property of this new content result class that we instantiated, and then the content type property was set to essentially an empty or a new instantiated media type header value with no real values to it. And then finally that goes on this content result class that we see here. Now, why did it bother with this content result class? Why did it create this new content result and then pass that content result? Well, if we look at the content result class, we can see that it inherits from this action result class. And if we open action result, I'm going to go to its definition, we can see that action result class is an abstract class that inherits from iActionResult. So ultimately, this content result class inherits through the chain from iActionResult. And iActionResult is the type that we need to pass back from when we run our index method. And all of this is happening, and all of it is pre-built in to that controller class that we have our home controller based upon. That is why it is so important. So just to kind of show you here what this content method is doing, because now that we've gone through all of that trouble, I'm going to comment all of this out, and we'll just return content method, and I'm going to pass in, and you can see here's the 4 different overloads that we looked through. And I'm just going to pass into my content a string of, hey, they're gorgeous. And that's all it's going to do, is it's just going to pass back a string of, hey, they're gorgeous. I'm going to save this and run this. And all we get as a response back is, hey, they're gorgeous. And if you're wondering if that is actually some sort of HTML code, I'm going to pull up Fiddler here. Again, I'm just going to use this useful tool that we saw in the last video, just so that we can actually inspect the object specifically. Yes, I know. I'm going to go ahead and call, localhost 52577. And actually, just again, I'm going to stop this for a moment, and I'm going to debug without debugging so that we don't get all this junk over here on the left-hand side of the screen, because that's fairly annoying. Remove all that, compose this GET request. I'm going to execute it, and we'll see that we get a 200 result. Okay. But if we look at the raw result back, all we got was this text, right? There's no HTML encoding. But our MVC stack went ahead and wrapped and put all these headers onto our response object via that result, that content method, okay? It's and being passed through the MVC stack. It puts all of these headers on there for us. And then our content result was just simply this, hey, they're gorgeous string that gets passed back. So this is the same thing that's going on with this content method as what we can see is happening on pretty much all of these methods, including this file method. If we see the file method returns either a file stream result or a virtual file result, which is really cool because all you have to do if you want to pass along a file and send a file to a user, you just have to pass in the string of the path on your web server, and then you have to say what kind of media content type it is. And you'll see the virtual file result if we dig down into its class. Okay, it returns virtual file result, and virtual file result is inheriting from this file result. And if we go to its definition, there's that action result class. And if we drill down once again, there's our iAction result. So even that that file method that I just showed you, it ultimately inherits from iAction result. And if we can see there's JSON, so you can respond back with a JSON object, which is really cool for web APIs. If you just pass back an OK, that passes back this HTTP OK result. There's partial views, and we're going to go over some of these that are more important for you to understand. But just know that all of these responses, all these methods that have some sort of results on them in the name means that they are essentially inheriting from that iAction result in some way, somewhere down in the hierarchy of your classes. It's inheriting from that iAction result, and that's why each one of these methods is so handy. All you have to do is just call that method and return the object that comes back from that method, and that returning of the value that comes back from that method satisfies this requirement that you send some sort of iAction result class. So there you go. I hope that this in-depth understanding of what's going on with this controller class has helped you. And I strongly urge you that, again, combining your skills and understanding of ILSpy and just kind of digging around and poking around inside of this controller class is going to tell you a lot about how you can use it and what we're really going to be pretty much doing from this point on in the video series.